For tuning in. I guess I'll reiterate the points that Joel and Ed made about Sea Grant doing a great job putting this together. It's really an honor to have this opportunity to talk to you about research that I've been doing, but lots of colleagues have been doing over the past 10 years to understand how sunlight breaks down oil and transforms oil at sea. Before I get going, I do want to introduce myself. I'm a marine chemist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I study how organic carbon is processed in the environment, particularly in aquatic ecosystems. And I study a wide range of organic carbon types, including natural organic matter, but also anthropogenic contaminants like crude oil and plastics. So Ed did a great job of giving a background on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the chemistry. But I do want to just paint a picture of how we get from the bottom of the ocean to the sea surface. The estimate was that about 5 million barrels of oil and gas were released over 87 days in the summer of 2010, and oil floated on the sea surface for over 100 days. And this point about oil floating on the sea surface for 100 days is incredibly important because it provided scientists time to respond to the spill and actually sample oil across space and time and evaluate how the oil was being transformed by nature. This contrasts most smaller spills that are closer to the shore, and by the time you respond to the spill, the oil is already washed up on the shore. So the rupture occurred deep in the ocean. You can see a picture here from a remotely operated vehicle that was developed by Hui. And you can see the oil and gas discharging violently from the pipe. And in this next image, you can see technology that was actually developed to sample and study hydrothermal plumes at the bottom of the ocean. So these gas-tight samplers that I'm showing you were developed by Jeff Seawald's group to study the chemistry of hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. They adapted this technology and took a sample of the oil and gas as it was being released from the pipe. And this proved to be extremely important because knowing the chemical properties and the physical properties of the oil that's being released can help predict where that material is going to go once it's in the environment. Ed touched on this a little bit. So the smaller molecules and gases got trapped at the bottom and created this underwater plume of hydrocarbons that the microbes ate pretty quickly. As Joel touched on, their nutrients are incredibly important for microbial degradation, and nutrients are not limited in the deep waters, which facilitated microbial attack of this oil and gas. But the larger compounds, they rose to the surface. And once they got to the surface, they didn't stay put, right? They moved around rapidly. And this is a image or a time-lapse video I like to show from Ian McDonald's group, just showing how fast the oil is moving on the sea surface. And what you're seeing is each pixel corresponds to an oil film that's seen from space. And the blue pixels correspond to a thin, sheeny film, similar to what you'd see if you'd spill gas at a gas station. And the red pixels correspond to a really thick film that has been weathered over some time and is likely an emulsion, meaning that there's been water added to it. And what you'll notice is that the oil is moving in multiple directions on any given day, and that's all driven by the surface currents of the water and then also the winds, right? And as those change directions, they're going to move the oil back and forth. And what you'll also notice is that when the oil reaches the beach, the pixel disappears, but that doesn't mean that the oil disappears. So as Joel just laid out for you, lots of oil washed up on the shoreline, and that's what I'm showing here is when those pixels move towards the shoreline, that's called deposition or sedimentation or beaching of the oil. When the oil's floating on the sea surface, it doesn't just stay the same liquid form that comes out of the pipe. It undergoes a series of weathering processes. And this is a generic conceptual model just showing you the different types of weathering processes that occur. It's not all the different weathering processes, but it gives you a picture of what could happen to the oil. Some of the oil can be dissolved into the water and get entrained away. Microbes can attack the oil. Some of the oil can evaporate into the atmosphere. Some of the oil can be oxidized by sunlight into new compounds. That can ultimately lead to emulsification, where you have water and oil that are bound together. And then ultimately this oil will move towards the shore and deposit or undergo sedimentation. So prior to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the general perception, if you look at all the conceptual models that depict the relative importance of the different weathering processes, what you find is that evaporation is considered to happen right away, and it is the dominant process for oil that's on the sea surface. So in this, I'll back up. In this model, what you're seeing is the different processes going up and down, and then left to right, you're seeing the time scale by which they operate. And the size of the bar corresponds to how important they are, or how important we interpret them to be. And what you'll also see in these conceptual models, I mean, this is a summary of dozens of models that are out there. You'll see that photooxidation is consistently considered to be a negligible weathering process. And it's also considered to be a secondary weathering process, meaning that these other weathering processes happen before photooxidation. And what I'll show you here, or explain to you today, is that this conceptual understanding of what happens to oil at sea has been changed, particularly this concept of how much oil is vulnerable to oxidation by sunlight, and the fact that we used to think of oil as a secondary weathering process, and now we consider it a primary process. So before I dive into that information, I want to just introduce the concept of sunlight oxidation. You know, everyone is familiar with this. It happens in your everyday lives. The most common examples are just pigments fading, right? So you can think of the pigments in your clothes that are fading over time when you wear them in the sun. I have a big forehead, so I have to wear a ball cap, and my ball cap fades over time from exposure to the sun. The same thing happens for the pigments on your car, right? You have, you know, the paint fades over time, and that's driven by light energy. Probably the most widely discussed environmental process or environmental issue right now is plastics in the environment. And plastics also fade due to sunlight exposure. This is an image from an exhibit at the Institute of Contemporary Art here in Boston from a couple of years ago, where Mark Dion presented different pieces of plastic he found in the environment. And you can see that with time, a Coca-Cola cap can have many shades of red, or a Gatorade cap can have many shades of orange. And this is largely driven by light energy. And then lastly, this happens for natural carbon in the environment. This is actually from a curriculum that we made for middle schoolers, but I always like to show these slides because it just shows that the chemical molecules that are in this case, tea, you know, those organic molecules that are brown, they fade over time. The same thing happens for Orange Crush or any of your favorite soft drinks that you use. It could be Coca-Cola or coffee. It's the same principle can be applied where these organic carbon molecules are being broken down by light energy. And in your backyard, something that happens every single year during the wet season is this pulse of organic carbon that comes through the Mississippi River and goes out to the Gulf of Mexico. This brown carbon gets processed by sunlight, which is one of the reasons why you can't see it as you move further and further offshore. And the ocean water is no longer brown, it's blue. So this concept of photooxidation occurs for oil spills as well. And in fact, sunlight dramatically alters the properties of spilled oil. So this is just a video I took. On the left-hand side is the oil that came out of the pipe. It's liquid. It has less than 10% of the molecules in this oil are oxidized. So if you think back to what Ed was talking about, less than 10% are the resins and asphaltenes that he was mentioning. It has a low viscosity and a low water content. And then if you look at the oil that's on the right, This oil has spent 7 days at sea, less than 7 days. We estimate anywhere from 4 to 8. It has 60% of of the carbon in the oil is oxidized. It has an extremely high viscosity, so much that it's more like a solid or a semi-solid than a liquid. It's actually emulsified, and it has a lot of water content, high water content. So clearly what you see is that the oil that is released from the pipe is not the same type of oil that we find in nature and that we're trying to clean up. So the next question would be, well, how does this happen? How do you oxidize over half of the oil while it's floating at sea? There's two ways by which you oxidize organic molecules. It's either direct photolysis or indirect photolysis. And in direct photolysis, what happens is the light absorbing molecules, the aromatics, the resins, the asphaltenes, those types of compounds that Ed was talking about, they directly absorb natural sunlight. So their absorption spectra overlaps with that of natural sunlight, and that causes chemical reactions that transform them into new molecules. The problem with this approach is that these types of molecules only account for less than 10% of the starting oil mass. So it's not actually possible for direct photolysis to account for the majority of oxidation we observed. So the alternative is that indirect photolysis occurs. And the way this works is that you still need that light absorbing molecule to absorb light energy, but then you produce these reactive oxygen species that have the capacity to react with a wide range of oil molecules, not just the ones that absorb light directly. And that's shown here in the middle panel where the raw species are being produced. These include things like singlet oxygen, peroxy radicals, hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide. We actually don't know which species drives this system. It's hotly debated in the literature. But in any event, these reactive oxygen species have a wide range of capacities to oxidize a lot of different types of oil molecules. And that's shown here in the third panel, where all the different shapes can be oxidized. They can be converted to an orange molecule representing oxidation. So the next logical question is, well, why does this matter? There's lots and lots of reasons why why this is important. The one I'll touch on today is just simple response operations. You know, how do we respond to oil spills? And how effective is our response plan at responding to them? There's lots of different tools in our toolbox, and they all have different window of opportunities to respond to oil in different parts of the environment. You all are probably familiar with all these tools. Chemical dispersants are used to break up floating oil into small droplets, which are then dispersed into the water column. Skimming is a physical removing tool where you're literally skimming the oil off the sea surface, just like you're skimming leaves out of your pool. In situ burning is a process where you gather the oil at the sea surface and literally light it on fire to remove it from the sea surface. And then if you don't capture the oil before it reaches these sensitive coastlines, you have to use other types of tools. And in this case, these folks are using surface washing agents to dislodge the oil from the rocks and then physically collect it there. So today I'm just going to introduce the concept that sunlight weathering has the potential to impact the performance of chemical dispersants. So on the left-hand side is an example of what happens or what is expected to happen when you apply dispersants to floating oil. And dispersants are a mixture of chemicals. There's a solvent, which provides an opportunity for the surfactant to interact with the floating oil. And that leads to the formation of these droplets, which are then dispersed into the water column. And this is really important because it removes the floating oil, which minimizes risks to animals that live at the surface. And on the right-hand side shows a schematic that we drew after finding out that under lab conditions, at least, when you apply dispersants to photooxidized oil, the interactions are completely different. So they're not as strong and you don't form as many droplets. So here's a couple pictures to show you what I mean by this. On the left-hand side is the crude oil, right? And in this case, we apply, crude oil to the surface of this beaker, and we shake it, and we measure how much oil gets dispersed. And lo and behold, 100% of the oil got dispersed, right? It's an extremely effective tool at dispersing this oil. This oil had 0.4% oxygen by mass. If you remember from Ed's talk, oxygen wasn't even on the list of atoms that were on that are in oil to start. It had extremely low viscosity, and it had really low water content to start. And then if we take an oil that was skimmed off the sea surface after spending several days there, less than a week, but 4 to 8 days, it had 5% oxygen, greater than 10,000 centipoise, so really viscous. And we had very low dispersant effectiveness, right? So these are labs experiments demonstrating this process, but we are using field samples to validate our lab studies. And this is what we see. So on the left-hand side is a video showing the interactions between the dispersants and the oil, where you see immediately there's interactions, and this is with the dark control oil, so it has been evaporated, but it has not seen any sunlight. And then on the right-hand side is the same oil that has been exposed to the equivalent of 2 days of natural sunlight. And what you see is that the interactions are just completely different. So to us, this is a call for more research into the influence or the impact of photochemical reactions on the performance of chemical agents used in oil spill response operations. So now if we take a step back and we go back to our conceptual models, there's a new view of what happens to oil at sea. And what we find is that photooxidation is more important. This is for surface oil only. So it's the oil floating at the sea surface. So photooxidation is more important. There's more oil that's oxidized by sunlight, and it's also a primary process. So this shows the synergy between photooxidation and emulsification, whereby when you add oxygen to the oil, you actually make it easier for emulsions to occur. Okay, so I just have a couple wrap-up slides here. I acknowledge all the folks that I've been working with over the past few years on this topic. Funding agencies as well. It's really been a great time learning about oil spills at sea and how sunlight impacts the fate of oil. And if you're interested in more information on this, Ed, myself, and a colleague, Chris Reddy, put out a paper in EOS, which was targeted at a scientific but non-technical audience. And we go deeper into some of these concepts. And then I also want to just thank the working group that we put together in December of 2018, that we had just a great group of folks reviewing hundreds and hundreds of documents to try to come up with this perception of how our view of the fate of oil at sea has changed after studying the Deepwater Horizon spill. And I'll make one pitch for everyone to come visit in Hui when you get a chance after this pandemic. And if you're a young scientist in the crowd, please feel free to reach out if you're interested in this type of research. Thanks, everyone.